Adolf Hitler's early years. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria on April 20th, 1889. His family moved to Germany when he was only 3 years old. He loved art, but his father did not approve. He actually applied to art school twice and did not get in. He became fascinated with German nationalism, which later fueled Hitler's life as a political leader. He joined the German army in 1914 for World War I. After the war, he served as an intelligence officer. He then served a year in prison after staging a coup, which he dictated most of the first volume of Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Mein Kampf. This book laid out Hitler's plans for transforming German society into one based on race. Hitler ran against Paul von Hindenburg for the presidency. Hitler came in second in both rounds of the election, garnering more than 35% of the vote in the final election. The election established Hitler as a strong force in German politics. Hindenburg reluctantly agreed to appoint Hitler as chancellor in order to promote political balance. Hitler then used this opportunity to mobilize German forces for war. Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. So he had social reforms. This included anti-smoking campaigns and dietary restrictions, racial hygiene, banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews, German citizenship, euthanasia for disabled children and adults. He believed in the cleansing of society. Jews, Poles, Iranians, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. were included. The 4 main concentration camps. This included Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald. Camp purposes. They used the concentration camps to jail those who opposed Hitler's government. Those who were released could leak what life within the camps was like, and this allowed men to support Hitler. Officially, they were used to reform those who were against Hitler and also put fear into anti-socialists. Hitler passed a law to make these camps legal. He called it protective custody. It took away all their rights and liberties, so no one could protest it.
Doctors and their work. Dr. Carl Snyder conducted psychological experiments on children, collected their brains, and dissected them after they were murdered. He committed suicide after the war. Dr. Herman Stiev conducted studies on female reproductive systems and lectured on his findings. He died a natural death. Levels of experimentation. In the first category, there is freezing, high-altitude testing, and seawater experimentation. The second category includes infectious diseases like malaria, typhoid, tuberculosis, yellow fever, and hepatitis. The second category also includes mustard gas, sulfa testing, and bone grafting. The third category includes serological experiments to further advance the worldview of races to the Nazis. They wanted to see how certain races withstood contagious diseases. A famous doctor by the name of Joseph Mengele worked at Auschwitz and conducted twin experiments where he sewed 2 Romanian boys together to create conjoined twins.
During the Third Reich, unethical experiments took place without the consent of victims. There were 3 categories of experimentation that Nazi doctors worked through. The first category involved experiments that regarded the survival of Axis soldiers. The high-altitude experiment was used in 1942 by Sigmund Rascher in an attempt to record and test the safest altitude in which German pilots could be ejected from. Prisoners from concentration camp Dachau were placed in a low-pressure chamber that simulated conditions at altitudes of roughly 66,000 feet. Freezing experiments also existed in the first category. In these tests, victims were submerged in vats of icy water for periods of up to 5 hours. The reasoning behind this torture was to study the effects of hypothermia so that Nazi doctors could exploit methods of caution to the German soldiers that were forced into icy ocean water. The victims were either naked or dressed in aviator suits while submerged in the water. Another experiment of the first category was the seawater experiment. In this test, Nazi doctors attempted to make seawater potable. Victims were forced to drink only seawater and were deprived of vital nourishment. Subjects given some type of seawater experienced excruciating torture, convulsions, hallucinations, madness, and even death. The second category of experimentation contained medical tests to aid illnesses and injuries that German soldiers faced on the battlefield. Scientists test immunization compounds and sera for the prevention of contagious diseases including malaria, typhus, typhoid fever, etc. Malaria experiments were also held. In Dachau, healthy prisoners were infected by mosquitoes. Once this was contracted, the subjects were treated in order to test the efficiency of the drugs used. The third category is composed of experiments that dealt with twins. These tests were created to show genetic similarities and differences, as well as to see how the human body can be unnaturally manipulated. An experiment included the injection of different dyes into the eyes to see if the color would change.
The death tolls of these 4 major camps are as follows.
Auschwitz, being the largest extermination camp holding the most deaths, is the most infamously known. Bergen-Belsen was known as the collection point where Jews were both put to work as well as transported to other camps. Dachau was known as the first labor camp where a great number of the Nazi experiments took place. Buchenwald was the largest labor camp yet held the second lowest death amount. There is not a specific number of deaths due to the Nazi experiments.
Since the experiments were conducted unethically, are they scientifically valid today? There are three main reasons why the experiments may not be valid today. One reason is because the physiological conditions of the patients could have caused the results of the experiments to be inaccurate. The second reason is because the experiments were conducted under false pretenses and therefore were not a benefit to the scientific community as a whole. And lastly, because the experiments were not replicated, there is no other evidence to support the original results.
The Nuremberg Code of 1947 came about as a result of the crimes against prisoners by medical experimentation. This Nuremberg Code provided 10 guidelines for doctors when taking part in human experimentation, including the greater good for society and human consent as the very foundation of experiments. Doctors needed to be held accountable. These are images from the Nuremberg trials that include doctors, generals, and spies that were found guilty and sentenced to death for the crimes committed during the Nazi reign.